It sounded like an easy job, something quiet under the radar. Just sit behind the counter, hand out keys, look presentable. At least that's what I thought it would be. Cedar Hollow is the kind of place you find by accident, an old roadside motel that doesn't show up on any maps, sitting halfway between nowhere and somewhere. The type of place where people stop only because they're tired and need a break. Anonymous, quiet, or it should have been. I guess that's why I didn't think twice when the manager hired me on the spot and didn't even ask for references. He looked at me with this strange blank stare and said, "Just make sure you follow the rules, all of them." I laughed it off, figuring it was just an old man's paranoia, maybe some kind of initiation joke. But when he handed me the list of rules, everything changed. They weren't just rules, they were warnings. I remember the first night I was left alone with those rules. I read them over and over, trying to understand them, trying to make sense of them. But the more I read, the more I felt uneasy. The rules weren't anything like the usual instructions you get at a job. They were strange, disturbing, written in faded ink on crumpled paper, like they'd been copied over and over. There were rules like, if you hear scratching at the lobby door between midnight and 1, do not open it. Or, if you see a man in a red hat in the parking lot after dark, turn off the lights and hide. Do not engage. Then there was Room 13. The rule for Room 13 was simple. Never book it, and if anyone asks for it, call the manager immediately. I remember thinking that these were just stories, ghost tales meant to scare the new hire. But the manager's face was stone cold, his eyes never leaving mine as he said, "Follow the rules, every night." I didn't know what he meant by that at the time, but something about the way he looked at me, it was as if he was pleading, like he was warning me that Cedar Hollow isn't just a motel. It's something else. The first night started just like any other shift, a quiet late-night job in a dimly lit motel lobby. I thought it'd be the same routine as every night. After all, I'd worked night shifts before, and the silence was familiar, almost comforting. The vending machines hummed quietly in the corner, casting soft shadows that flickered in time with their glow, while the clock above the desk ticked at a steady rhythm. At first, everything seemed normal. The only guests were two older couples, both asleep by the time I took over the desk. The room around me was still, with nothing but the muted, droning hum of the machines and the occasional creak from the old wooden floors. My eyes grew heavy as I leaned back, letting the minutes melt into each other, lulled by the steady tick-tick-tick of the clock. For a brief moment, I felt almost comfortable. But then, close to midnight, I heard it. A faint, barely noticeable sound at first, like something scratching gently against glass. It was so soft I thought I imagined it, but then it came again, slightly louder, more insistent. It sounded like claws dragging slowly, deliberately across the lobby's glass door. The sound cut through the silence, sharp and jarring, pulling me out of my sleepy daze. My body stiffened, the comfortable silence around me dissolving into tension. I listened, hoping it was just the wind, maybe a stray branch tapping against the glass. But there were no trees outside. The scratching continued, growing louder, each scrape pulling me further into a tense awareness. My mind raced, trying to explain it. An animal, maybe? A raccoon? But the scratching was rhythmic, almost intentional, like something intelligent was trying to get my attention. I could hear each claw slowly dragging from one end of the glass to the other, pausing for a heartbeat, and then scratching again. I froze, my pulse hammering in my chest, each beat a countdown to something. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a split second, instinct urged me to open the door to see what was out there. But then I remembered the rule. The manager had said it in that flat, serious tone. If you hear scratching, do not open the door. The rule echoed in my head like a warning. I pulled my hand back, fingers trembling, and took a small step away from the door. The scratching continued, a slow, methodical drag that grated at my nerves. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an animal. There was something wrong. The air around me felt thick, like it had weight, pressing in on me with each scratch. A heavy silence hung in the lobby, wrapping around me like a blanket of dread, as if even the ticking clock was holding its breath, waiting. I stood there watching the door, eyes wide, barely daring to blink. The scratching didn't stop. It just grew louder, more insistent. It was as if something was testing the glass, like it was taunting me, daring me to break the rule and open the door. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, every instinct screaming at me to turn away, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, frozen by an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the silence itself was alive, like it had a presence, a weight that pressed down on me, filling the room with a feeling of waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than any silence I'd ever experienced. It was as though the entire world had fallen still, holding its breath. The air was thick, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I waited, heart pounding, listening, but there was nothing. No ticking from the clock, no hum from the vending machines, just an endless, consuming silence that seemed to go on forever. And in that silence, I felt something, a presence just beyond the door, something that knew I was there, watching, waiting. My skin prickled as a cold sweat trickled down my spine. I stood there staring at the door, half expecting to see a face press against the glass, or a hand slowly trace its way down. But there was nothing, just the heavy silence, thick and alive, wrapping around me like a shroud. And even though I couldn't see anything, I could feel it. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning in that oppressive silence. All I knew was the suffocating weight of dread pressing down on me, the lingering feeling that something was just outside biding its time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move, taking one slow, trembling step back from the door, and then another. I kept my eyes fixed on the glass, half expecting to see something materialize in the darkness beyond. But the door stayed empty, and the silence remained unbroken. I spent the rest of the night behind the desk, my body tense, every nerve on edge. I didn't sit, didn't relax, and barely dared to breathe. I just stood there, waiting, listening to the silence, waiting for the scratching to start again, or worse, for whatever had been out there to try something else. The clock on the wall started ticking again, its sound snapping me back into reality. But even then, the sense of dread lingered. When dawn finally broke, and the first rays of sunlight seeped through the lobby windows, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. Whatever had been out there was gone, or at least it felt that way. But the feeling didn't fully leave me. Even as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that something had seen me, had been aware of me. And I knew that night would come again. The silence, the scratching, they would return. As I walked out of Cedar Hollow that morning, my legs felt weak, my skin prickling with a lingering fear that hadn't quite let go. I glanced back one last time, my eyes drawn to the glass door, half expecting to see something. But there was nothing, just my reflection staring back at me, pale and shaken. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably some stray animal in an overactive mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I could explain. And as much as I tried to brush it off, I couldn't help but wonder if the scratching would start again, if it would only grow louder, more insistent, with every passing night. The second night at Cedar Hollow, it was even stranger than the first. I had tried to brush off the scratching sounds to tell myself it was just a fluke, maybe a stray animal. But deep down, the unsettling heaviness from that first night lingered, like a dark shadow trailing me wherever I went. I felt it as soon as I walked back into the lobby that evening, a prickle at the back of my neck, a whisper of something waiting. It was right after sunset, and I had just settled in for my shift. The lobby was quiet, the familiar hum of the vending machines blending with the steady tick of the clock. Everything felt the same as before, but somehow the silence seemed more ominous, charged like it was hiding something in its depths. Then out of nowhere, a man appeared in the lobby. He was tall, lean, with a presence that was somehow off. His clothes were dark, blending into the dim lighting. But what caught my eye immediately was his hat, a bright red hat pulled low over his face, casting a shadow over his eyes. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something about his stance, the way he held himself, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. He didn't say much, just walked up to the desk with this slow, deliberate stride, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. When he got to the counter, he paused, tilting his head ever so slightly. He didn't ask for a room, didn't make small talk. He just raised his hand, pointed down the dim hallway, and in a low, almost hollow voice asked, "Room 13?" A chill ran down my spine. I felt the blood drain from my face as his words registered. Room 13 wasn't booked. In fact, I'd been explicitly told that it never was. The manager had been adamant about it, his voice as cold and serious as I'd ever heard it. No one was to be placed in room 13. Ever. I opened my mouth to explain, my voice shaky, trying to find the right words to tell him that room 13 wasn't available. But he just smiled. It wasn't a normal smile, not one of warmth or friendliness. No, this smile was cold, empty, a hollow expression that didn't reach his eyes. In fact, I couldn't even see his eyes beneath the shadow of that red hat, but I could feel them watching me, unblinking, piercing, as if they could see right through me. "I'm sorry, but that room isn't available," I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't respond, just kept that eerie smile, his gaze fixed on me, as if waiting for something. Finally, he nodded, turned around, and walked slowly out of the lobby. I watched him disappear into the parking lot, his figure fading into the shadows, the red of his hat the last thing to vanish. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief, thinking he was gone. But as I stood there, I noticed something lingering in the air, something faint but unmistakable, a smell. It was metallic, sharp, with an edge of something that made my stomach churn, like rusted iron or old, stale blood. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it filled the lobby, thick and suffocating, clinging to the air. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, that I was still on edge from the night before. But that smell, it was more than just a lingering scent. It felt like a warning, an omen, as if it was trying to tell me something. Something dark and unsettling that I couldn't quite grasp. The night passed slowly after that, each tick of the clock dragging on, the minutes stretching into an eternity. But even as the hours crept by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of the man in the red hat. His smile, that cold, empty grin, was burned into my mind, haunting me every time I closed my eyes. And that smell, it didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, lingering in the corners of the lobby like a phantom, a silent reminder that he had been there, that he would be back. When dawn finally broke, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with dread. I wanted to believe that the man was just some odd traveler, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that he was something else entirely. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew I'd see him again. And somehow, I knew he'd be waiting for room 13. By the fourth night, exhaustion had taken hold of me, a weight pressing on my chest that no amount of coffee or quick naps could shake. Sleep was no longer an option, but even with my eyes wide open, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in some kind of waking nightmare. Every creak, every murmur of wind against the motel walls felt amplified, sharp, like it was aimed directly at me. And the encounters, they kept coming, growing stranger, each one tightening the grip of unease around me. The scratching was almost constant now, more deliberate, more focused, as if it was trying to draw me closer to the door, waiting for me to make just one mistake. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I glance at the security monitors and see things, figures in the parking lot that shouldn't be there, shadows that moved independently of any light source. I'd blink and they'd be gone, leaving only the cold, silent footage behind. But even as the screen showed an empty lot, I could feel something lingering just beyond the reach of the cameras, something that refused to be seen. One night, around 2 in the morning, a guest stumbled down to the lobby, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her room key. She asked me if there were other guests here. I told her no, that she was one of the few we had checked in. Her eyes widened, her expression shifting from confusion to a kind of dawning horror as she whispered, "But there was someone outside my window, a man with a red hat." The words hit me like a blow, each one lodging in my mind, as cold and sharp as glass. I tried to reassure her, forcing a smile that felt brittle, telling her it was probably a trick of the light, that it was late, and things could look strange in the dark. But as I spoke, I could see it in her eyes. She knew I was lying. She could tell, just as I could, that there was something wrong here, something watching us both. She backed away slowly, returning to her room with one last, searching look over her shoulder, as if she expected that man in the red hat to follow her. As she disappeared down the hall, I was left standing in the empty lobby, feeling more alone than ever, my pulse pounding in my ears, my eyes glued to the security screens. And yet, a part of me knew that what was out there wouldn't appear on the cameras. It was clever, patient, waiting just out of sight, biding its time. And every night it came a little closer, its presence growing heavier, pressing in on the edges of my vision, its intentions as unknowable as they were unrelenting. I tried to leave. After a week in that place, every instinct in me screamed to get out. Nights had grown colder, as if something was leaching the warmth from the air itself. The rules, they'd started to feel less like protection and more like bindings, chaining me there, trapping me in the role of night receptionist like some cruel joke. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were feeding off my obedience, my silence. So I waited, watching the faintest hint of dawn break over the empty highway, then packed my bag and slipped out, hoping to escape before whatever was there could notice. I drove fast, pressing the gas pedal to the floor, praying to outrun whatever presence held sway over that motel. But as the sun crept higher, I began to notice something was off. The same trees, the same road signs kept appearing, no matter how far I drove. Mile after mile, it was as if I was tracing the same stretch of road on a loop. Then in the distance, I saw it again. The neon glow of the motel sign, flickering like a beacon through the morning fog. I slammed on the brakes, staring in disbelief. I was back, right where I'd started. I tried again, and again, changing direction, taking different exits, even speeding down side roads. But each time, I'd end up back in that cracked parking lot, facing that motel with its sagging roof and peeling paint. I could feel it pulling me, each attempt weakening me, draining my resolve until I was just numb. I stepped out of the car and stared at that flickering sign as it buzzed in the cold morning air. Each flash a silent reminder that I was trapped. There was no escape. I don't know how much longer I can stay here, or if I even have a choice anymore. I feel like I'm slipping, like pieces of me are unraveling, fading away. I look in the mirror, and the reflection staring back isn't quite right. It's me, but off. The eyes are hollow, a little too wide, as if someone else is looking out through them. Every time I glance, the face in the glass looks more like a stranger than me. I tried calling the manager again, hoping for an answer, something that would pull me back, anchor me to what I know is real. But no one picks up, and now I'm starting to question if he ever existed at all, if any of this is real or just some nightmare that won't end. The whispers, they've grown louder. Sometimes I hear my own name, called out in the dark, like it's echoing from somewhere deep inside the walls. They're asking me to stay, insisting that I belong here. And the strange thing is, I feel it. Some deep part of me feels the pull, like I'm being woven into this place, like my own mind is slipping away and filling with shadows. And the worst part? I'm beginning to believe that if I stay here, if I keep following the rules, then one day someone will check in and find me, standing at the desk, greeting them with a hollow smile. I'll become part of Cedar Hollow, forever. So if you're ever out there on the road and see the sign for Cedar Hollow Motel, don't stop. Keep driving. Ignore the flickering lights and the promise of rest, because once you walk through those doors, once you agree to follow the rules, you're theirs. Remember me, if you can.